Taylor Miesel. Make sure I say that correctly, because I think I used to call you Miesel, and that doesn't sound right. So Miesel.
I respond to both.
Assistant Chief at the airport, talking to us about landings today. And, you know, the thing with landings is that you have a decision to make on taking off. You don't have a decision to make on landing. You have to land that plane. So that's the first step, I think, in even making a good landing, is making a good choice. Should I even take off for the day, right? But let's talk about, where does a good landing start? Where does it start at? Is it like on short final? Where do you think it starts?
Yeah, well, at a minimum, the traffic pattern needs to be successful to lead into a successful landing. The prudent pilot should be aware of conditions prior to getting into the traffic pattern. But for sure, by the time you're in the pattern, you need to recognize that the landing's probably not going to go well if your pattern is not successful leading up to that point.
So as they say, accidents, when they happen, they can lead back halfway into the flight, right? And so you're kind of saying with a good landing, you need to have a good traffic pattern, because if you come in high, you come in hot, you come in whatever the case is, it's going to completely throw that landing off.
Absolutely. Yeah, it kind of sets the stage for how the landing is going to end up.
So where do we start at with the traffic pattern? What are we looking for? What's the core factors to make the landing successful?
Sure. Well, starting off on your downward leg in particular, we need to make sure that we are staying ahead of the airplane, starting there throughout the rest of the pattern. That means being ahead on getting your checklist done in a timely manner. It means being on your airspeed, anticipating what the conditions are that day. That's probably one of the biggest challenges we see, in particular with low time pilots, is understanding, based on the winds in particular, what is that going to do to my pattern, how I need to correct for that, and ultimately how that's going to affect transitioning to the landing phase.
So how do winds affect the landing?
Well, typically you have some element of a downwind wind pushing you, a tailwind on the downward leg. That's why we call it the downwind. And that is going to have an effect on your ground speed. Really, a traffic pattern is just managing time to the runway, if you think about it. So if you have a stronger tailwind on your downward leg, that's going to mean that you have a higher ground speed, which means things are going to happen more quickly. And as you're turning onto the base, for example, and that wind turns into a crosswind, you need to think about how that's going to affect your ground track on the base and how that's going to set you up for your final approach.
Okay. And so if I extend my downwind because I'm not really paying attention, now I'm going to be low on base, low on final probably. And
Correct.
That's going to create what for me when we're coming in for the landing then?
Low is always a situation you don't want to be in. We have some tools in our toolbox to fix an approach that may be slightly high, but when you're low, it's a little bit difficult to fix.
Okay.
So you never want to find yourself in that position. And on top of that, it could be a potential safety concern if you're coming in low.
So what would be the ultimate decision then for someone who is low and maybe not configured properly? What should they do?
Well, never force it. The go around is always an option that you have, and let's try it again next time and fix those errors and see if we can't make it happen on the second round.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people want to be perfect every time. But I can tell you, every single pilot that has come through UND has done a go around and multiple go arounds. And it's much better to do a quick little go around and come back and try again than to force something that could be damaging to your career down the line.
Correct. Yeah, it's important to not see a go around as a penalty.
Right.
It's a normal part of the process and training. They happen at the airlines, even with experienced pilots. So it's nothing to be ashamed of. It's making that decision that's correct in light of safety, knowing that we can come around and try again and fix those errors on the next time around.
Let's talk about final now. We get on final. What are we focusing on, our eyes, and what's the overall view of a good landing and what we're trying to accomplish?
Yeah, well, when we're on final, you want your eyes to be where you want to go. So on your aim point, ultimately. We are looking outside the majority of the time is where we want to be. It doesn't mean that you're ignoring your instruments inside, particularly the airspeed is important to cross-check. But we don't want to be focused inside in the cockpit when we're coming into land. It's very important to look at where we want to go outside on the runway.
Okay. Talk about the crosswind component, because that's that's tough. I mean, and we have wind in North Dakota. That's just how it is. What are we doing with crosswind to be successful with our landings?
Sure. Yeah, with crosswind, you need to, again, it helps to anticipate knowing what the winds are going to be doing. So if we're not thinking about crosswind and we find ourselves on final being reactive instead of proactive, that's going to set you up for failure. If you do have a bit of a crosswind component, there are a few different ways that we can compensate for that on the final approach. We can either do a wing low method side slip, where we're actually drooping one of the wings and flying along a straight track, or you can crab into the wind, which is a little bit easier to do, but it does mean that eventually, since we can't touch down in a crab, we're going to have to transition out of that crab prior to touching down on the runway.
How can a pilot be more proactive versus reactive?
Knowing what the winds are doing based on what you've seen in the pattern prior, or if you've done landings prior to the final approach that you're on, that can help understand what exactly is happening. We have weather reports that we can look at prior. We have weather information in the cockpit to access. And some of it is just feel on the controls, looking at what is happening to your ground track on final to determine what are the winds doing? Because there are plenty of situations where maybe you're hearing reports of one thing and you find that the winds are actually doing something completely different when you're actually flying the approach.
And that comes with experience too. You can teach somebody the reactive versus being proactive, but until they've gotten into that experience and they've been put in that situation, it's just something you have to kind of find out for yourself in
Correct.
the end. So how about PAPIs? Should I just stay right on that PAPI?
PAPIs are helpful. The problem is we don't want to over-rely on the PAPI to determine what our appropriate glide path is. There are plenty of airports that don't have a PAPI installed, or maybe the PAPI is inoperative. We still need to be able to fly a stabilized approach into a good landing without the assistance of a PAPI. So that's an important skill to develop, which means that we know how to use one when it's there and how to use it effectively and properly, but at the same time, we should be comfortable flying an approach, determining what is an appropriate sink rate and what we should be seeing outside of the front window without that lighting aid present as well.
What should we be looking for on a stabilized approach? Because, when you start talking about day versus night, that's another big thing. When we don't have the PAPI or VASI or anything to guide us down, what should it, I guess the best way you can explain it, what should a stabilized approach look like from the cockpit?
Sure. Well, we have established criteria for the definition of a stabilized approach, but ultimately for what you're seeing outside, a lot of it comes with experience. Determining, is my descent rate appropriate? Is my sink rate appropriate? Am I on my target speed? It doesn't mean that you're perfect, but it means that you're able to make small adjustments and to maintain a normal descent to land throughout the approach. We don't want to be making big changes. We don't want to be behind the aircraft in not understanding what we need to do to keep the approach stable.
Pitch versus power. How does that relate?
That's a 3-hour conversation.
I know. Give us the nickel tour on it.
Yeah. Ultimately, when we are pitching for that aim point, by and large, and they go hand in hand, right? Pitch and power are always related, in particular on final approach. But when you're pitching for that aim point, you're going to be adjusting power as appropriate for your airspeed. So you may need to be adjusting power throughout the final approach segment. In particular, if it's a gusty day and the winds are changing, you may find yourself needing to adjust power, or maybe we end up getting a little bit high on glide path, and now we need to pitch the nose down for that aim point again. We're likely going to have to, as a result of that, reduce our power to maintain that stable approach.
In a perfect world, we're a beam and we bring the power back. If we maintained the perfect distance, what we considered a stabilized approach, should the power pretty much be set at that point, or is there going to be fine-tuning on final?
If you set the power appropriately, beam the aim point of the downwind, you shouldn't have to do much with it on the downwind or the base leg. Once you get to final, really that depends on the conditions of the day. If you have a strong headwind, chances are you're going to have to add some power as opposed to what you carried in on the downwind and the base. If it's a calm winds day, we're likely going to have to start reducing the power shortly after turning on the final in order to keep the aircraft in a stable approach in order to come in at an appropriate airspeed for landing.
So we get on short final. We're getting ready to land. Now we're really getting into the meat of things here. What are we doing? We're transitioning to the roundout or the flare, and how are we doing that?
Well, the first factor to consider is airspeed. We have an airspeed that we're flying on final, but that's not an appropriate speed to come in and touch down at. So we're going to have to decelerate. The rate of deceleration is going to depend on the winds. It's going to depend on our approach path. But having some approximate targets in mind could be helpful. We know we want to touch down the aircraft just above a stall. In essence, if we're doing it properly, we are touching down, stalling onto the runway about a foot off the ground. So our job is to transition the airspeed to that point where by the time we're ready to touch down, we're at that speed where we're stalling onto the runway.
And, you hear people, I've heard people talk about the end of the runway. That's where I'm chopping the power and that's where I'm flaring out. Is that what we're doing?
Chopping the power usually doesn't work too well. We are should be anticipating the conditions of the day and the rate of deceleration that we're going for. And it is going to change day to day, and that's what's challenging. So sometimes we see the power chop when we haven't done a good job of planning in advance for our rate of deceleration based on the conditions of that day.
How's the flare going to change day versus night, dusk? I mean, you have a lot of different visual factors to contend with for that.
Yeah, so the depth perception in relation to the runway is what becomes challenging at night. Additionally, in most cases, we don't have lit center lines. So you may lose that visual element that's very important during the day for your lateral alignment. And now at night, we're relying much more on our peripheral vision when it comes to runway edge lights, for example, to determine, am I on center line for touchdown?
So where are our eyes at during the flare process? Because a lot of people say look down the runway. Other people say, well, you should try and visually see the side because you'll flare too high on a night approach because you get that, I can't remember what it's called, the black hole effect or whatever.
Yep, black hole effect.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you'll flare a little high for that. Where should we be focusing our eyes at during this process?
Yeah. So as you transition into the roundout, your eyes should be transitioning to the end of the runway. At night, that might be a bit of an approximation if you can't distinctly pull out the end of the runway, but you're using both your vision at the end of the runway and your peripherals at that point as you transition through the roundout and into the flare. Particularly as we get into the flare phase, the nose is going to come up above the end of the runway, so you're going to lose that visual. And at that point, we're relying on our peripherals to determine things like wind drift and ensuring that we're going to touch down with the longitudinal aircraft's axis aligned with the center line.
Let's talk about seat height, because that can vastly affect the landing.
Yes. Very important that you have the proper view out the front based on where you're putting your seat. If you're tall like me, that might mean you're going all the way down, and I sometimes can't get low enough. Mm-hmm. Other individuals who are on the shorter side may actually need, we find often, to use some assistance in the form of a back cushion or a seat cushion to get the proper view. So it's important that each individual does what they need to ergonomically in the cockpit to ensure they have a proper sight picture, and that includes being able to see the top of the cowling of the aircraft, which is helpful when you have something to reference outside the window in relation to the runway when it comes to landing.
So we're in the flare. How am I going to ensure that I'm not going to tail strike, or I'm not going to over flare or under flare?
Yeah, knowing where the nose should be in relation to the horizon in the flare is going to be the best way to determine what looks normal. We don't want to be referencing inside the cockpit on our instruments when we're in the flare. And if, in the case of most trainers, if you put the nose just above the horizon visually, that tends to be a pretty good spot for touchdown to ensure that we're touching down on the main wheels first in a tricycle gear aircraft and then allowing the nose to settle while not over pitching to the point where we're concerned about a tail strike.
But we want to keep the nose off as long as possible too.
Yes, our goal is to touch down on the main wheels first and then allow the nose to gently settle as the aircraft begins to decelerate, as opposed to touching down on all three wheels at one time.
Right, and that additional lift is going to help produce additional drag and help you slow down a little bit more. So we come in, we land, maybe we bounce, maybe we start to lose directional control. Is that a proper place to go around? It
depends. In the case of a bounce, usually the best scenario in that situation is to choose to go around. If you are balanced and you're back in the air and you have adequate airspeed to do that safely, you should absolutely go around. In the case that you're on the ground and losing directional control, don't overcorrect would be the biggest thing there. Depending on your speed, you may have the option to go around if you just touch down. But if you're solidly on the ground and losing directional control, the best thing to remember is don't overreact and break down your steps of correction, where we want to first just parallel the center line so we stop deviating and going towards the grass. Then we can work on getting ourselves back onto the center line in the middle of the runway. And often we see issues where we're trying to do all of that at once, and we're using too much input because perhaps there's a little bit of panic, and that's where you'll run into more trouble. So it's important to be methodical about that process and to ensure that you're doing it in a manner that is safe to fix whatever that issue may be.
1 foot challenge. What are we trying to do with that?
Yeah, so the 1 foot challenge means your goal in the flare is to hold the aircraft off the ground as long as you possibly can. And that's going to allow us to touch down at the minimum airspeed possible. Meaning, if you can, to the best of your ability, keep it about 1 foot off of the pavement for as long as you can. And that means in the flare, you're going to have to continuously be increasing back pressure to do that. That is going to help you complete a quality landing.
Okay. And then you said earlier about hearing the stall warning. In a perfect world, you'd hear that stall just before touchdown, that little chirp. That's going to help you with, obviously, the roundout and the slowing down of the aircraft, not touching down at too high of an airspeed, increasing your landing distance there.
Correct.
So we touched down, and we're done now. We're done flying, right? That's
Absolutely.
It.
No, that's a very common misconception and tendency, especially for lower experienced pilots, is to think, okay, I'm on the ground and now everything's over, and that's not the case at all. After touchdown, we still have a job to do to safely decelerate and keep the aircraft aligned on the runway, exit the runway, and then, of course, continue to taxi back to where we're parking. What
are some tips for people, with snow and ice on the runway, but also just in general on not exiting the runway at improper time?
Sure. Well, the first thing to keep in mind is never feel forced to take the next exit. If you're going too fast, or you feel that you may be going too fast, or maybe you're even not sure, and you're questioning, am I going too fast to safely exit? The best thing to do is just continue down the runway to the next exit. Don't worry about causing delays with ATC. They're not going to get mad at you. They want you to be safe too. And if that means continuing on down the runway a little bit longer to do that, then that's the best choice to make.
If I land with crosswind correction in, should I keep that in, or should I take that out on landing?
So I like to think of the landing phase with crosswind as the opposite of what we do on the takeoff roll. So on the takeoff roll, you typically start with your ailerons fully deflected into the wind if there's a crosswind present. And as you increase in your airspeed, you're going to start rolling the ailerons to an appropriate position for rotation. And at landing, we're doing the opposite. You're going to touch down with a specified amount of aileron input as required, depending on the velocity of the crosswind. And as we decelerate down the runway and we're losing control effectiveness on those ailerons, we want to be increasing the aileron deflection into the wind as we slow down. So by the time you come to a complete stop, you should be fully deflected into the wind.
Okay. Well, Taylor, we appreciate you stopping by, talking landings with us today.
Absolutely. It was fun being here.